Good morning. Welcome to Dynamic Leadership. Today I'm using an illustration with Jim Collins' books, Good to Great and Great by Choice, because it ties right in. When I was searching for a solution for small businesses who want to scale, and if you think about growing and scaling, which I'll get into, it's a complex initiative, or it's a complex set of challenges ahead of you because it costs money to grow and it costs money to scale, and you're constantly balancing those. And I'll talk about some parameters, but a few weeks ago, I did a hot take and said dynamic leadership is the best leadership approach for small businesses seeking to grow and scale. And when I'm talking about growing and scaling, I'm talking about 10x. You may have heard this term 10x thrown around, and it seems like it's out of reach. There's several things happen when you go after a 10x goal. One of them is that the rewards of that goal, the benefits of that goal, and I don't mean monetary, I'm talking about all the intrinsic rewards that go with it, are suddenly big enough to make you want to do the hard work that's necessary. The little goals don't always have that. The second thing that happens with 10x is that it forces you to focus on what's really important, and you let go of a lot of other things. I was talking to somebody just the other day about how sometimes it seems like it takes somebody losing everything before they could finally step into their purpose. But I would argue it's not necessary to lose everything. I think the process of losing everything allows you to get rid of the baggage that you're dragging along from first base trying to get to second base. Now, whether you let go of that baggage because you're forced to, because you lose everything, or you let go of that baggage by choice, which is what I prefer and what I talk about with agency and personal leadership, then you're free to move forward. So that's just a quick backdrop. A quick backdrop on why dynamic leadership. The other thing is with small businesses, they have no time to, especially when you're growing and scaling, to concern themselves with a leadership process. They start hiring leaders, and oftentimes what happens, it depends, right? Because there are companies that have boards and there are companies that are doing it, just doing what they've always done. And both of those can work. With the right board in place and the right mentors in place, they'll have you hiring these people before they're needed, and they'll have you hiring the right people, getting the right people on the bus before telling everybody or deciding the big destination for the bus, getting the right people on the bus. And the idea of draining the swamp or fighting alligators, right? Sometimes we're so busy fighting alligators that there's no time to drain the swamp, and we're hiring by the seat of our pants. And it's no wonder why some companies have these toxic cultures. Imagine having different leaders coming from different metaphors. You got a political metaphor, a bureaucratic metaphor, then you got a nonprofit metaphor and a family metaphor coming in, and they're all trying to work together, and the employees talking in the cafeteria or at lunch and on different teams, and they're realizing how convoluted this process is. And that's just one example. But when you leave it to chance, leaders are going to do what they've done. And before I leave this slide, I'll add one more thing in there. And that is, and again, there's exceptions, but I think the general rule proves, or the exception proves the general rule in a sense. Many of you probably are familiar with and probably use some form of behavioral descriptive interviewing, where we look at the past as a predictor of the future. It makes a lot of sense. You're looking to solve this need. And you know what? When that first came out, I would say in the 80s, the first time I heard about it, I started using it. It made a lot of sense, because when you hired somebody, the lay of the land did not change, sometimes for years. It was basically, that was the model. This was before the internet. We didn't even have computers on our desks in those early days. It wasn't email, it was paper mail. And so the rate of change, in fact, if I recall, fax machines didn't show up until the mid 80s. So it wasn't until fax machines showed up, and then followed by Federal Express and overnight mail, that we had this sort of instantaneous information flow. So when information went by US mail and went back and forth, you didn't have the rapid change that you do. Now, fast forward to, 30, 40 years after Moore's Law, which said every technology capability will double every 18 months. It originally said every 12 months, but then they did a backward look and said more like 18 months. We're on that steep part of the curve. It's so steep right now in terms of change that by the time you hire somebody based on what they did in their last 2 years, the lay of the land may have changed. So here's the point, hiring using a behavioral descriptive interviewing approach, which I agree with, by the way, but within the context or within some parameters, because that hiring decision is based on their conditioning. Those leaders did what they did because of their conditioning. Why do I say that? Because 95% of everything we do is done by habit. And if we're running by habit, then it tells me that those habits are going to repeat, which is why the past is a good predictor of the future. And those habit patterns are from the past, let alone being from a different organization, which is not that big a deal because leaders are leading people, not things. The point being that what you need moving forward may not be in somebody's conditioning. You may need to train it and teach it. And that's why I'm saying dynamic leadership is what you want to have if you're a company that's interested in growing and scaling. All right, so dynamic leadership, I already talked a little bit about the metaphor. So team metaphor for growth and profit organization is the only one I would use. Now you can argue that, but if you've ever worked in an environment with a family metaphor, there's problems. One, how do you deal with discipline issues with a family? How do you deal with disparity in pay when you want to pay for performance with the family? How do you combat the matriarchal thing that happens with the family? When you go with a team, everybody has a common goal. Everybody's pulling in the same direction. What's nice about the team metaphor, and this gets back to the 10X, when you're using a team metaphor and you're embodying the principles, when I'll be talking about with dynamic leadership, flexibility, adaptability, et cetera, consistency, discipline, commitment, the difference between your business with a team metaphor and a sports team with the team metaphor is that the sports team has an opponent that's trying to stop every play. This is why they have practice during the week. This is why they get together. This is why they have simple plays that everybody knows, and they have audibles, and because they want to be able to adapt and adjust when the opponent does something different. In business, what happens is because there's no opponent, it can become boring, right? Especially when you look at, in response to VUCA, we have simplicity and discipline and consistency, simplicity, disciplined actions. It can become boring and we stop trying to do other things. Or in the bureaucratic environment, we create our own opponents inside. Same with the political environment. We create our own opponents. We don't do it intentionally. It just happens. And this is why it's so important to know who you're hiring as a leader, because as you hire these people in, if they're coming from an environment that was political, they're going to bring that political backdrop into your organization. I know in the manufacturing, in the big manufacturing days in the US, that often happened where product managers, brand managers would sort of be fighting against each other because the president was pulled from the best performing brands. And then the CEO was pulled from the presidents and vice presidents, in a sense. And you don't know what that metaphor is until you spend some time talking to them about it by asking them some questions. So in the behavioral descriptive interviewing, I would ask questions to uncover what sorts of metaphor they ascribe to. And I believe a person can change because that's the beauty of metaphor. If you change the metaphor, a person's behavior can change because they'll step into it if they're willing to. If they've got a stake in the ground and they're not changing, that's a red flag for me. More on that, and I think next week I'll be in a position to actually walk through live. We'll do the same live event at 7 a.m. I haven't worked through the details yet, and I'll have a live event following it. It'll be an audio event. And what I'll do is I'll put a Zoom room in the description of the event so that you can join in the Zoom room. If you're a small business looking to grow and scale, you can join in the Zoom room, no cost on that. And we will literally walk through creating the on-ramp for your own organization, building dynamic leadership in your own organization. I'm a firm believer of on-ramps, because if you look at pivots and changes, a pivot and a change is something we've never done before. We're stepping into new ground. Too often, we will look at a pass fail. And if you think about going back into school days, 70% is passing. Now, I'm not suggesting that we run a company at a 70% level, but when we're trying something new, if I'm getting 60 or 70%, I'm still in the game. I don't have to have, perfection. This is where you get the control when you're doing copywriting. You can do A/B testing and just keep moving that thing. Have some gating so that if we don't get this solved by this point, we're going to go back to the drawing board. You don't need necessarily a plan B. It's gating that tells you you've had enough information that this strategy is not working. But I wouldn't base it just on the fact that it didn't work the first time, because when you're doing something new, that's the learning curve. It's like expecting a kid to ride a bike without ever having them practice riding the bike, and then you just take off the training wheels and say, go ride the bike. No, you got them riding the bike with training. They have to learn how to pedal, and they have to learn how to pedal fast enough to keep their balance. They have to learn how to steer, and they have to learn that their body has something to do with the balancing of the bicycle. And then when you take off the training wheels, you're holding the seat, and then they can ride. But you have them stay on the sidewalk until they can maneuver and actually control it, and then they go into the street, and then you let them go off the block. You get the point. Why wouldn't we have that same kind of approach? Just because a person is an adult and just because they can understand what you're saying doesn't mean that what you say one time conditions the behavior. What I just described with that bicycle, the kid riding the bicycle, is you're conditioning a behavior. And that takes time, repetition, intensity. Or duration, repetition, intensity. And you're not going to get it with one set of words unless you have so much leverage as a leader. And this happens, that what you say, people take to heart, and they are just either freaking out or super motivated just by your words, because you've conditioned them to have that response. As a leader, sometimes you're in such a powerful position relative to the person you're talking to, which is why, I say sometimes you can't take them full strength, right? And you can't give your full strength to some people because their conditioning doesn't handle it. They catastrophize too easily. And so you can have words create that, but that's a conditioned response that happens, or the person brings it with them into the situation. My point is, if you're leading an organization, you're not going to rely on just some words. So we have to have this on-ramp, and that's what I'll build with the group next week. We'll actually build the on-ramp using a template that I use. I've managed multi-million-dollar projects, not managed, I should say, led. It's a leadership template. Management of the project is an operational approach. Leadership of the project is about leadership and strategy. And those are different skill sets, and it requires a different mindset. And that's what we'll be developing, is for owners and executives who want to build dynamic leadership into the organization. So I have 4 dynamic leadership videos out on my LinkedIn events section, and you can watch those. I did the hot take, and then I did tying it into self-determination and intrinsic value. And then last week I did the building blocks, which actually sort of shapes and starts to materialize what dynamic leadership is. Today, I'm going to push on that and provide some strategies that you will be using once you adopt dynamic leadership. And then next week, we'll start building it real time live. So I'll do the 7 o'clock will be I'll bring in some more examples, probably talking about, I'll bring in some more examples around dynamic leadership to make it practical. And then we'll switch into the working event. So it'll be an audio event on LinkedIn, and I'll have a Zoom room available for us to actually do work. That's next week, Friday at 7 a.m. Pacific time, the same time as this one. And then the audio event will probably start at about 7:45 Pacific time. All right, dynamic leadership definition: an adaptive and flexible leadership approach that empowers leaders to navigate change, make swift decisions, and align their teams with evolving business needs. There are many examples to follow. It supports the principle of it supports principle-centered leadership, which is very important to me, because if you don't have principle-centered leadership, what is your leadership centered on? And if it's centered on politics or money or sacred cows or whatever it is, you're going to have some challenges because they're not going to endure. When you use principles, the nice thing about principles, unlike strategy, is that you know that principles are still going to be around 10 years from now. Those same principles are going to apply. And that's why I focus on intrinsic leadership. I won't get in, or intrinsic motivation. I won't get into it today, but you can watch 2 weeks ago live event. And I talk about the intrinsic motivation, which is where people actually enjoy the activity itself. And yes, with just 10% overlap between the person's goal, purpose, values, and what we're doing in the organization, we can create the situation where a person is intrinsically motivated because they enjoy the activity itself, that activity being what they do at work. The context for my position statement, we got a misspelling there, but the context of the position statement is 400 employees and roughly $50 million. Those two don't always go together, but you have outsourcing and there's so many different options. You have mergers, acquisitions, you have things changing, but generally speaking, you can look at those two. And the reason I use those two is because, and it's sort of arbitrary, but at some point above 400, around 400 or above, you're moving into a situation where you have a board. And so you end up with complexities because that board, they become stakeholders. And depending on your investment model, that you could have a situation where the board not only puts in place the CEO, but they also have to sign off on all the executives in that organization, which makes it a little more difficult to apply dynamic leadership because you don't have total freedom of action. So small companies lack the economy of scale, and that's why we have to be more tightly disciplined. And this gets back to not having an opponent, but because you don't have the economies of scale, you sort of have an inherent obstacle that has to be overcome when compared to larger competitors, because after about 50 million, after about 400 employees, the revenue per employee starts to go up. And these large companies have the luxury of, they can have employees not being optimized, not being in an optimal situation, and it's not going to hurt them because they have so much revenue, sometimes double the amount of revenue per employee. So that puts you at a disadvantage as a small business. They also don't have the complexity. So multiple stakeholders. The board is a good thing, but a board can also bring some other challenges depending on that board. So sometimes you have board members who are investors in other companies. Maybe they own other companies. That's why you brought them on the board, because they've got these experiences and their ideas that, yeah, we'll get this vertical put into this company, and that vertical is going to feed my company over here some business, and blah, blah, blah. And that's just an example, but you get the point. And so you now have these other stakeholders, and you're working on using the approach I'm talking about today based on Great by Choice, and they're not having it. So there are some complexities. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work above 400 people. It just means that you have to be aware of what's going on. This is where you have, in a sports team, you have coaches who, they won't coach the team. They won't take the job if they don't have freedom of action. They carve out their bubble. And in that bubble, that's what I did when I was building high-performing teams. I had to carve out a bubble because my deal was I would take on huge projects that were failing, and I would turn them around and then deliver on time, on budget. And I used it using a lot of these principles. And because it was based on neuroscience. I didn't know it at the time, but I was basing it on conditioning rather than speaking. By creating that bubble, and I was able to do it because I had a track record of turning around and delivering these huge projects. I was able to do things my way. And that's not about my way or the highway. It was about doing it a way that works, which is very much aligned with dynamic leadership, so I'm biased, But I've also looked at other leadership. I actually thought leader as coach was going to make the cut. It didn't, not as the umbrella. Dynamic leadership is the umbrella, and I have leadership as coach as a pillar, because as you get into the executive ranks, that leadership takes on more of coaching. As a CEO with the C-suite, it's more of a coaching model. So leader as coach becomes more important as you go up higher and higher, because those people have so much freedom of action and fewer touch points. The rate of change I mentioned can make plans obsolete. So this graph is like where we are on the Moore's law. When you have, and if you take a penny and double a penny every day for 30 days, it's $10 million. But the 90% of that $10 million happens in the last few days. Think about that. The last 3 days is where you get that massive increase. And that vertical line starts somewhere around the 25-day mark, where it starts to go vertical. We're vertical. We are vertical in the Moore's law of technology capability doubling every 18 months. And it's not turning around. And just think, you've got AI programming, additional AI and programming responses, and you got algorithms running algorithms. And if you advertise on social media, you see it happening. I remember in 2014, when I first started doing social media advertising and all, I remember reading that Google changed its algorithm, because in those days, this was just as Facebook was coming up doing search. So Facebook had not really gotten into heavy search, and so heavy advertising, and so the big opportunity was search, and people would try to game the system with the search algorithm. And I read somewhere that Google changed the algorithm 10,000 times in 1 year. If you look at trading, if you look at what happens with financial trading and the micro trades and multiple trades happening in milliseconds, or trades happening in milliseconds, you know how fast these algorithms can change today. I can't even imagine it. And when you see, like in the US, we've got an election going on, and when you see a party raise $1 billion in several months, $1 billion, that's just one race. And imagine all the other races. You got billion. Where do you think that money's going? And it's flowing. And if you're advertising, you probably notice in the US, every summer we start getting spikes in advertising costs or decreases in efficiency. But anyway, volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity, complexity, and ambiguity, VUCA, is greater than the SWOT analysis. It wasn't always that way. The SWOT analysis used to endure. I still support the SWOT analysis, obviously. But the problem is, by the time you get the strategy shaped around what the analysis told you, it might be too late, because things change so fast. You have to have a system that allows for that. The same way Agile gave way, or I should say waterfall project management gave way to Agile, because in between there, you were doing a lot of user experience, and the waterfall project management just didn't work anymore. So you have Agile. And the same way that Agile, it might have too long a cycle in some spaces, and you're going to have this constantly pivoting. It's a very dynamic pivot. It's almost like operating with a pivot environment. And I've always said that project and operational were separate. And I think that's why a lot of large projects fail, is because people try to take an operational approach and apply it on projects. In a small business, you want to be real careful about that. Operational excellence, yeah, I'm all for it. But when you're doing a project, when you're building a new capability, that operational approach is based on efficiency. It prioritizes efficiency. What you want in a project is you want to prioritize effectiveness. You need both. But when you're making decisions and choices, where you prioritize, because if you don't want to prioritize by efficiency in the operational model, you're going to have more problems. The challenge with not prioritizing effectiveness in the project world, those problems don't show up right away. It takes a while. And so the dopamine connection gets lost. That's my opinion. This is why you want to have a different approach. If you do Myers-Briggs, I would definitely want to have some S's and N's on the team, because the S's tend to do more of the operational and N's tend to do more of the project type work, or lean in that direction. And you want to have that balance. You want to hear both voices. Why great by choice? Great by choice, uncertainty. This is from the book that was written in 2001. No, I'm sorry, 2011. Uncertainty, chaos, and luck. Why some thrive despite all of those. Builds on the principle of good to great by focusing on how companies thrive in unpredictable, chaotic environments. A 9-year study. And what I like about Jim Collins' series is that he uses comparison companies and he uses public companies. So he's able to get all of this data, reams and reams of data, and he's able to look at which companies are this similar enough to these that are doing 10x. And then he looks at the companies of that group that made the inflection point and compares what was true about those companies and those leaders compared to what was true about the comparison companies. And that's why it worked. And I'm telling you, when you get into this, you will see that 10x is more accessible to you than you may have believed. It's more available to you because, one, you don't have an opponent trying to stop your every move. Yes, you have competitors, but they're not out there play by play. They're not returning the ball. They're not returning the goal. They're not, coming back with their own goal. They're not answering every goal that you have. They don't have a defense trying to stop your play. They don't have a week's worth of watching your tapes, your films before they play you. That's not how the competition and business works. So you don't have this opponent. So when you use these principles that winning team coaches use, which, by the way, team coaches embody dynamic leadership, not what they do on the field. Watch what they do off the field, in between the games and during the week and at halftime. That's where the dynamic leadership shows up. On the field is dynamic leadership as well, but that's not how you're playing. And the loose link that I make to that is that as a business owner, your focus is always preparing for the big game. And what's the big game? Your big game, you never know when it's going to happen. Your big game is when there's an opportunity that gives you the possibility of 10xing. If you look at stock at portfolio management, and this is the reason why the buy and hold guys are against trading, is because the majority of the big moves happen in very short periods of time, over short periods of time. And to be able to time those big moves, you're likely to be out of the market during that big move. So it's similar to that, is these big opportunities are going to happen, and dynamic leadership positions you, and you're always prepared for that. Then you can take charge. You have the healthy balance sheet, you have the leadership capabilities, you've got the project discipline and the operational principle, etc. Before Great by Choice, there was the book Good to Great, and this is where I got hooked, because Good to Great happened around the .com era, and 1,400 companies over a span of 40 years. They looked at the data, and the goal was to determine why some companies transition from being good to great. Again, he had a set of comparison companies, reams of data, because they were public companies, and he was able to look at which ones took off. And he calls it the inflection point. But not only did they take off, they had to perform for at least 15 years. That's key. And this is where the 10x comes in. And so as a leader of a small business, as an owner of a small business who wants to scale and grow, you can read book after book, you can talk to people, follow trends, whatever you want to do, but you're going to be hard pressed to find the kind of research that went into Good to Great that gives you you'll be hard pressed to find the kind of research that went into Good to Great. And so rather than look for that holy grail, looking for that panacea that doesn't exist, you can follow the principles that he used, that he just talked about in Good to Great, and apply those in your organization and make that fit. Those principles work. And this is where I was saying that sometimes you may run into some challenges if you have other stakeholders, because sometimes those principles are against what your stakeholders might want. So that's another story. It's beyond the scope of this conversation, but I'm putting it out there because I think that some large corporations may have a challenge going after dynamic leadership, because dynamic leadership prioritizes around the employee, not in terms of giving away the farm or giving up profitability, But in terms of building an environment where employees are intrinsically motivated to do to do the work, so you're not relying on incentives. And that's where it starts to rub, because if you think about a board with investment involved, there's expectations they have, and there could be a high control component. And if there's a high control component, there's no appetite for the patients to get into an intrinsic motivation. So that's an important point. I went over it quickly, but I want you to think about that. Maybe go back in 2 weeks ago to the live event where I talk about intrinsic motivation and how that applies. And before Good to Great, that was a response to Built to Last. Built to Last, he talked about great companies, and these were visionary companies. And what happened is some of those became the comparison companies that didn't make the cut to good, from good to great. And then some of those companies became the comparison companies that didn't stay great as the great by choice. And I would say that Built to Last, in a sense, could have been a response to Tom Peters' book, In Search of Excellence. What was interesting about In Search of Excellence, and these were companies that were dominating in the late 70s and 80s. The book was written in 1982, In Search of Excellence, and there was a follow-up, Passion for Excellence, where he did sort of a similar thing that Jim Collins did, where he looked at some of these other companies. It was really interesting that a lot of your low-cost operators didn't make it. They were gangbusters during the time, but what happens is when things get tough, the low-cost operators, in my opinion, they don't have the balance sheet. The strength of the balance sheet is not there to weather the tough times. And because they've done things with efficiency, they haven't had to step up their game because they're attracting a low-cost buyer, and that low-cost buyer is buying on price. They're never challenged to raise the bar internally of what they're delivering in terms of value. There can only be one lowest cost operator, and there's very, very little advantage to being the second lowest. So a low cost strategy is not a good strategy, in my opinion. I would much rather see you add value, find ways to add value using economies of scale, which will get easier and easier as you grow and as you have customers, and then you start providing new services to existing customers, or maybe you provide existing services to a new set of customers. As you can play that back and forth as you start to grow and scale. There's a lot written about being successful after breaking through this barrier. And I would say that, yes, it's important to be able to break through that barrier, but there's not a lot written about what it takes to break out of the inertia, this inflection point. And that's where Good to Great comes into play, because he looks at what was existing for those companies. But humans have this same thing, because we're conditioned to run like this, and then we have to break through. And it's a challenge to get through that. I've got some slides later on. It's a challenge to get through there because you're working against stories, you're working against your comfort zone. You're getting into this cognitive dissonance because you've got limiting beliefs that just don't support it. And then I have leadership, an adaptive, flexible leadership approach that empowers leaders to navigate change, make swift decisions, and align their teams with evolving business needs. I'm going to go back here if you want to take some screenshots. So I didn't have my screen on. All right, so just real quick. Dynamic leadership. Then I have the definition. And this presentation will be up on LinkedIn if you want to look at it later. I'll put an updated one on there. The 400 employees and the 50 million. The rate of change and volatility and SWOT analysis. Why great by choice. And we have, before that, it was Good to Great. Good to Great was a response to Built to Last. And then here's where we are now. All right, so I was just saying that we've got to talk about this, what's needed to be able to rise above the line here. And it takes a leadership approach. It takes strategy, but also takes a leadership approach, because it's a lot of noise that happens in here, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. People, remember I was talking about, you hire people based on their conditioning. They're going to struggle with changing their behavior to move above that line, just because that's just the way life is. And they're conditioned. 95% of everything we do is done by habit. What made them successful may not be what you need to make this crossing the barrier. And it may be what you need up here, but you need a certain kind of leadership here. So this is the idea of getting the right people on the bus, and then making those decisions with the right people. You also want to get the wrong people off the bus too, because the wrong people off the bus will become your internal opponents, which you don't need. Sports coaches embody dynamic leadership. Successful sports coaches, they create a strong team culture. They're adopting strategies. They're constantly adjusting. I mentioned it before. There's so many principles that apply to dynamic leadership when you look at what coaches do, more so off the field, but as well on the field too. It's just that that's in the game. So the on the field is during those big opportunities, make hay when the sun is shining. Like right now, you've got a lot of companies scrambling to try to figure out how they're going to make AI work. And there's a window that people are trying to figure it out. If you're doing enough trial and error, then you'll find your right way that's right for you. And what's nice about taking the approach that we use with Good to Great and Great by Choice is that you will be able to design a way that works for you. All right, Built to Last, 1994, focus why visionary companies endure over time. The mid 90s. So this is probably not something you're interested in, but you can see why during this era, it made sense to have a behavioral descriptive interviewing approach. It made sense why the SWOT analysis was so important, because things were much more stable. Now, by 94, we were starting to see the internet, but it wasn't into the companies until the dot-com era. And that was a wild time. If accountants were scratching their head because people were valuing companies based on clicks, and it wasn't turning into sales. And it was just very interesting. This is why the bubble broke, because the stock price was up there based on clicks. And then you have Good to Great. And that was where I got really involved reading Jim Collins. And his principles applied with what I had known about principle-centered leadership and what I had been learning from the field of neuroscience. We didn't call it neuroscience at the time. It was called that, but we weren't thinking of it that way. But that aligned. And because I was in sales operations, it was an easy way to test results. You could see very quickly, did it work or did it not? Because sales is sales. And I was able to test these neuroscience principles. And this is why personal leadership and agency is very important to me. And it's part of my curriculum for dynamic leadership. Is you've got to have the personal leadership in the agency, or you're not going to be able to do dynamic leadership, because the world is just too volatile. And you've got to have that agency where you can get back to a growth mindset no matter what's going on around you. But I was able to test those principles real time with projects, roughly 7 high-performing teams over a 15-year period. And I was able to refine and refine and refine based on real data. And it was during that time that I was looking at Good to Great, and I kept seeing this alignment. He's talking about big companies, but it worked on small teams as well. Later, I think all that is encapsulated with self-determination theory. So yes, you can study the neuroscience and you can study the principles, but if you get your head wrapped around self-determination theory and then 3 pillars, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which is what I talked about 2 weeks ago, you can start to see the benefits of intrinsic motivation because you're creating an environment where people enjoy coming to work. And you can start there. That's why I say dynamic leadership, you can start today. And I have a couple of slides at the end that'll help you with that. The big thing about Great by Choice, so now he had these good to great companies who everybody was waving the flag and the banner. Yes, this is the way to do it. And then the financial crisis hit. And the financial crisis, I would say 2005 to 2006, it was starting to cause some problems. They were starting to sell those swaps offshore because they had to go further and further out to find buyers. And that's how they knew something was going on. And then the credit market started tightening up for businesses. And when it hit, there were companies that literally disappeared in days. In days. Once they no longer had money and they couldn't pay for payroll because they were basically borrowing to fund their growth. And they were borrowing and funding the growth. And when that credit dried up, they couldn't make payroll, they couldn't pay rent, they couldn't pay providers. And that was just a big ripple effect. And some of those companies didn't make it. Some of those great companies that Jim Collins said. And so I think he felt, I'm glad he did. He wrote the book Great by Choice, because now not only do we see what it takes, built to last, to break through the barrier, then we see what it takes to get those results for 15 years. And now with Great by Choice, this is 13 years ago, we now see what it takes to adjust in a VUCA environment. And, you know, we have more VUCA today than ever. So to me, it makes sense. And as a small business owner, why reinvent the wheel, right? Why go out and try to find something new when Jim Collins has already laid it out for you? You can have this as required reading for even if you don't go back to Good to Great and Built to Last, have this as required reading. You don't underestimate the power of common language. And this is back to the conditioning. If 95% of everything we do is done by conditioning, and you have common language, imagine every time, and I said conditioning comes from repetition, duration, and intensity. Every time you mention a principle, you are reinforcing that principle. And this is what we'll talk about next week when we start building your own approach to dynamic leadership real time. You're now conditioning that into your leaders. Why dynamic leadership? Agility and adaptability. Let's see where we are. In a VUCA environment. So I would say that if you have agility and adaptability, but you're also using consistency and discipline, so you're doing it within parameters. It's not, these two may seem mutually exclusive, but you're doing it within a set of parameters. It's a response to VUCA. Operationalizing leadership. When you start hiring your leaders, you wouldn't expect a sports coach to bring on a new player and not go through some sort of onboarding and training and getting them synced in with the plays and all that. You have to do that. So why would we hire a leader and not tell them what the leadership process is for this organization, and not have a development plan, or at least a set of assessments to make sure that they can do these things? When I talk about a development plan, and I talk about it being 2 years, there are some leaders who don't really need to be developed in that space. They just need to check off that they know how to do it. For example, presenting to an audience of 400 people. I'm just making that up. That could be something that they have to demonstrate. And as a leader over a 2-year period, you're going to look for an opportunity for them to speak to some large audience. This is what I mean by a development plan. You don't leave this to chance, because in that 2-year period, they would be ready to get into another position. And now you know what position to put them into, because they've shown you their strengths. And I would say you can have a development plan that lasts for 2 years for every employee. At the entry level, there's going to be more touches and more training and more events that happen. At the senior level, it's more like leader as coach. As I said, there might only be 4 or 5 things that they have to do over that 2-year period that you want to observe. 360-degree frameworks or feedback mechanisms, I think, would be a part of that. Now, the good to great, the disciplined, and he talks about these principles like the flywheel principle, momentum through steady progress. I would do the book injustice to try to say that I'm explaining these things here, but it's the idea is a huge, heavy flywheel that it moves very slowly at first, but once you get momentum, and see, that's where it can become boring, because what you got to do is just keep turning that flywheel. But it's that flywheel that builds your balance sheet. And a healthy balance sheet allows you to handle whatever comes your way. The hedgehog concept: focus on core strengths and keep it simple and running with your strengths. That's that consistency and discipline. First who, then what. This is important. You want to be getting the right people because they've got conditioning. But see, now with what I talk about with the personal leadership and agency, and once you see how that works, not only can you change your own habits, literally, you can replace your habits on purpose, and it gets easier and easier the more you do it. You can actually start to see the roadmap or the on-ramp to get your direct reports to change their leadership as well, because you understand habits from a different perspective, through a different lens. And so while, yes, you do have to get the right people on the bus, it's also getting the people who are on your bus into the right mindset, into the right perspective. Because you get the right perspective, the outcomes can change. So I would say that, yes, first who, then what, in terms of getting the right people on the bus. But I would also say have the skills to lead. This is why Leaders Coach comes in, to coach them into becoming the person that this next thing needs. Stockdale paradox: balance the brutal facts with faith and success. Admiral Stockdale, I saw this guy speak in the 90s. He was in a concentration camp, and the whole point was the situation was dire, but he's the guy who they came up with, like, tapping Morse code to be able to communicate with the other prisoners. And the point about Jim Collins actually came up with the Stockdale paradox. It embodies a growth mindset, because what you're saying is, we've got a really difficult situation here, and it's probably not, the odds are against us, but I have enduring faith that we're going to prevail. It's having those two at the same time. This is the epitome to me of a growth mindset. And in my personal leadership work, we talk about getting back to a growth mindset. I want people getting back to a growth mindset in seconds, so it doesn't even look like you left the outside world. Right now, people can get snapped into a fixed mindset. I've seen people stay in a fixed mindset for weeks, and difficult to come out, and they just spiral. But you can actually get back to a growth mindset in seconds with some of the techniques and strategies I talk about. The strategies for scaling: 20-mile march, consistent progress. This is great by choice, regardless of the conditions. So you have to resist the temptation to chase shiny things. And at the same time, when things are tough, you have to resist the temptation to take it easy. So in that 20-mile march, the idea was that you do the 20 miles a day, no matter blizzard conditions or what. It was about an expedition to the Arctic. It's a great story in the book, but you can just Google 20-mile march and read about it. It's fun. Then fire bullets, then cannonballs, test small. And today, we talked about Skunk Works back in the 90s. There was Skunk Works and guerrilla marketing and stuff. Today, with Facebook pages, you can have several Facebook pages for your company. And you can have, even if you have a web developer and a big design team, with something like ClickFunnels, I can literally create a landing page, tie it to a Facebook page, create an offer, and have that offer out in the public within hours. Literally, quality stuff. And the more you get your library built up, the faster it goes. And so you could have a person on your team. Every team, for example, could have somebody who can do this Skunk Works, constantly testing. You want to test some ad copy? You don't have to go back to the developer. You just change it, do A/B testing, ABC testing if you want to, just by doing different links. You can do A/B testing in the platform. And what's nice about ClickFunnels is on its way to being an enterprise type platform. So it'll grow with you. I'm not suggesting it'll replace your web developer. People have done that and get rid of a lot of tools just by using ClickFunnels. But that's not the point. The point is you can test with ClickFunnels and do that Skunk Works within days. You can come up with an idea at 8 a.m. and have somebody work it out, and then present it to your team at 8 a.m. and have them already implemented by the end of the day. And that's the innovation. So I would say that if you have a company that tends to write a check every time there's a problem, that's their response to problem solving, that company is going to be weaker than the one that drives innovation to address problems. Innovation, then write the check. Sometimes you could say, I want 2 solutions, one no-cost solution, and then one ideal solution. or three. I want a no-cost solution, a low-cost solution, and then an ideal, and make that decision. Force the innovation, force it on because there's things that you can let go of. If you're trying to get to second base, there's things you can let go of as you're leaving first base. And then leadership as a system, operationalized leadership. You want a structure for your leadership practices, and you want everybody to have the same page. And you start thinking about promoting people, succession planning. Everybody's got the same language. Resilience, strategic leadership for complex situations, agility, adapting quickly to market conditions, and then building leadership teams, a strategic focus on growth. This is where you have a differentiator. This is what makes it possible for you to get to 10x, because there's no opponent. First of all, the outside world doesn't even know what your leadership process is. They don't know your plays. And so when opportunities come up, it's almost like taking a great team, take basketball, for example, and have a winning team with no opponent, just somebody to inbound the ball. And there's no opponent. Imagine what that score can be. Just think about it. The score is only limited by how many times they can throw the ball down court. And you get the point. There's no opponent. I think this is something you really want to get your head wrapped around when you start, because next week when we do this building, we'll be using some examples of what winning coaches have done. And then there's some challenges to scaling. There's an intricate balance between investment, complexity, and leadership during scaling, reinforcing that the message that dynamic leadership plays an important role in guiding businesses through these turbulent phases of growth. There's just that constant balance. Now, once you get above that 400 employees or $50 million revenue, you have more freedom of action because you've got a healthier balance sheet, and you have the flywheels turning faster, and it's got more weight to it. And you have your structures in place. You've got your protectors. You've got your legal team in place, keeping you from getting sued, hopefully. And you just have more help, more opportunity. But beyond that, you're dealing sometimes, like I said, it's sometimes you have to get up. Do I drain the swamp today, or do I fight alligators? And even though you're fighting alligators with one hand, you're still trying to drain the swamp with the other. That's why I want a leadership approach for businesses who are growing and scaling. And then good to great, the focus transitioning from good to great, the core idea, disciplined growth, and the flywheel concept, pre-dot-com bubble burst, corporate sustainability concerns. So this is what was going on during that time. And then great by choice, focus on thriving in uncertainty and chaos, which is what we have today with the VUCA. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. The core idea was a 20-mile march, fanatic discipline to stay true, and then fire bullets and then cannons. Test small things. That was the ClickFunnels example. You can test with bullets before shooting the cannonballs. You don't have to go to your web developer to change ad copy. You can do that with ClickFunnels and test it. And with your Facebook page, you can just run ads. You don't have to go to your advertising agency. You can just run ads internally just to test it to see. Key takeaways: dynamic leadership enables disciplined growth, agility, and fanatic discipline is a response to VUCA. So VUCA is happening so rapidly. If you're trying to respond to every whipsaw, you're going to be off. It's like trading. It's like day trading compared. You're going to miss the big move opportunities. So yes, you do have to adjust, but keep it in your tight parameters of strength and your discipline. Leadership's impact on success makes it a differentiator. Back to you don't have an opponent the way a sports team does. Simple enough to begin today. Self-determination theory. Last week I talked about building blocks. I'll put one of those slides up later today in this presentation. But you can start today implementing dynamic leadership. Start with yourself. Start with your own personal leadership in your own agency. If you're not doing it already, have a meeting with yourself at least once a week. You talking about working on your business by yourself at your best time, working, and that's project time work. That's not operational work. And you're focused on effectiveness. This is where you can build out your ideas for what's going to be the next skunks work. And then you could test it using the examples I was talking about. Breaking through the inertia. So this is that point I made it earlier. You've got to be able to break through the inertia, but understand that there's a lot of comfort level with the status quo. And then that's the diagram. So I was describing this before. So you have the comfort zone here, the status quo, and then you have to break through the inertia. This is the inflection point talked about in Good to Great. But you've got the unfamiliar and the unknown, and the unfamiliar and the unknown to the unconscious is a threat, or are a threat. And so you have to be able to have the resilience so that those threats don't take you off your game. And then recognizing that they're there, but also recognizing, the strongest guy in town doesn't have to worry about all the noise because they know that they're going to be fine. It's all just happening around here, but they're going to be fine. It's like, that's where people talk about, you play the course, you don't play the opponent. You do your thing on the course, you stay focused on that. And discipline, consistency. So we have the VUCA noise, no question about it. And opportunities can create VUCA, threats can create VUCA, and then there's comfort in repeating the actions, even though they don't work. And it's because you don't have the VUCA, you don't have the threats of the unknown. And so people like being in it. This is that we've always done it this way. I have a associate, they work in a government contractor, and there's still so much the way it's always been done because they're serving governments, and governments are like locked in to their methodology. And these 3 and 4 year cycles on products. It's just amazing how it's always been done this way. It affects promoting, it affects succession planning and all. And so I have this breaking through the barrier of inertia. This is a challenge for leaders. And when we do the development of the dynamic leadership for you, I'll make sure we talk about what are your strategies to break through that barrier, because it's important. This is where you want to decide who's going to be on that bus to go through there, because you need the right people. And it may not be the people who are going to help you lead up here. And it may not be the people who were doing a great job here. You'll have to decide what is your own barrier and what does it look like, and then go from there. And then this is that slide. You take a screenshot of that, but building blocks for dynamic leadership. I'm not going to get into it too much right now, but you can see personal leadership is right at the top. The empowering autonomy, not only of your own autonomy, but of your direct reports, and then have them provide autonomy. And autonomy can even be used as an incentive, but it starts with having personal leadership, because you've got to be comfortable in who you are to be able to start framing out the autonomy. You can think about circle of influence versus circle of concern. Is the more people can do within their circle of concern, their circle of influence grows, and you give them more latitude, and that grows the influence more, and then they get more latitude. But you see, I go through steps of onboarding, task assignment, feedback and development. This is that development plan I was talking about. I'd like to see a 2-year development plan, operational excellence, project management, and then 10X vision. And up here in this feedback and development, you should have checkpoint meetings. I think minimum 2 checkpoints a year plus the final review, but ideally 3 checkpoints a year. And especially for your top performers. For your top performers, I might even do them more frequently than that, because it's tied into the development plan and you're conditioning new behavior. And you can go back and look, but I talked about feedback. Three examples of supporting intrinsic motivation: feedback, observation-based. So observation, what your observable behavior, a 3-to-1 ratio of praise to reprimand. And you do that by giving them positive feedback, which you can do if you're using observable behavior. You can go back and look at 2 weeks ago, the intrinsic motivation. I covered this one. And then having strategies not only to get yourself back to a growth mindset, but also your team members. Empowerment, progressive capability. It's based on progressive capability. And that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the simple version is you give a person a new assignment and you meet with them 5 days on week 1, 4 days on week 2, 3 days on week 3, etc. But you can also apply that to a day. Today's, you're going to say, we're going to meet 5 times today to talk about this. Then tomorrow we'll meet 4 times. And you can do it in months. It's the concept is you want to condition the behavior, and that's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And if we didn't do that, then checkpoint meetings. I talk about start, stop, continue, and doing it 2-way. That's a very dynamic 360. But I also like the real 360, or the full 360 feedback. You should do one as an owner, have your direct reports, and it's nice if it's facilitated, because you're going to have so much leverage over them. You might squash some of the opinions that are coming up. You need to have a facilitator sometimes to help you break through your own, reactions. and then development plans, as I was talking about. And here's fostering that. This is the motherhood and apple pie, but I wanted to put it in some context. You know, I see so many infographics about what people should do. And this is why I talk so much about personal leadership, because to know and not do is not much better than not knowing. And so you have to have the personal leadership and agency to actually get yourself to do these things and to do them in the right way where you're building intrinsic motivation. This is not about just, yeah, I know it. No. Can you do it at the big game? And remember, the big game is a lot of pressure, because the big game is when you have a majority of your 10x work happening. That's the stress. You've got to be able to know and not do, or to know and be able to do only in easy times. That's not good enough. You've got to be able to do it under the most stressful environment you can imagine. That's when you have a winning strategy. So it's not just this. It's about building yourself to the point where you can do this. Now, you can see more of this content, and what I do is these lives, like I'll edit them and clean them up and then put them out on my online publication, dynamicsofneuroplasticity.substack.com. I have some of the, you can become a subscriber. Some of the content is accessible without a subscription, but the higher, the interactive, where we actually have working sessions and people can figure out how to do it, and you got feedback going on, you have to be a subscriber. So that is it. I got through this in an hour. And dynamic leadership, the ideal leadership style for a growing small business. I hope you join me next week, 7 o'clock Friday. I'll do a presentation talking about some examples that coaches use to apply dynamic leadership to sort of prime us into that thinking. And then we'll go into a working session probably by 7:45. And there'll be an audio event on LinkedIn. And I'll also have a Zoom link that'll be in the description of the live event, which I'll set up. That should be available by Monday. All right, we'll see you then. Thanks for joining.